Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage John J. DeGioia, President of Georgetown University.
President Clinton, Secretary Rubin, distinguished panelists, guests, good afternoon and welcome to Georgetown University. We're honored to host today's symposium on Clinton-Gore Economics, Understanding the Lessons of the 1990s. We're especially grateful to welcome President Clinton back to Georgetown, to count him as a very special member of our alumni community. It is rare to have the opportunity to gain the perspective of this unique collection of political and economic leaders. Their distinctive insights will enable us to reflect on the economic lessons learned throughout President Clinton's time in office, a period characterized by a successful bipartisan effort to balance the budget and to consider the effective application of these lessons within our present context. It is fitting that this colloquium take place here in Gaston Hall. It was just over 20 years ago, in late October 1991, when then Governor Clinton gave the first of 3 major policy speeches right here in Gaston Hall in the context of launching his candidacy for the presidency. The first speech, entitled "The New Covenant, Responsibility, and Rebuilding the American Community," introduced some of the most important themes and ideas that guided the Clinton administration in the 8 years that followed his election. Today, we are fortunate to have the chance to examine many of these ideas in a new light and to gain the incomparable perspective of the leaders who were instrumental in developing them. This kind of dialogue holds particular resonance for us at Georgetown, both as a Catholic and Jesuit university engaged in the world and as a global institution located here in our nation's capital. These distinctive features of our identity enable members of our community to be deeply engaged in scholarship that directly informs major national policy challenges. It's within this context that we're honored to host today's event. It is now my privilege to introduce to you former Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin, who will deliver today's opening address. Secretary Rubin began working for the White House in 1993 as Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and as the first Director of the National Economic Council. He began his term as our nation's 70th Secretary of the Treasury in January 1995, serving in that role until July of 1999. Secretary Rubin, it's an honor to welcome you to Georgetown.
Thank you, President DeGioia, and let me add my welcome to all of you today. It was an enormous privilege to serve in President Clinton's administration and to have the opportunity that all of us who served with him did have to contribute to the enormous accomplishments that he had for the American people. And it's a privilege to be here today to frame our discussion of that period and what it meant. When President Clinton took office in January of 1993, unemployment was over 7%, median real wages had been sluggish or stagnant for 2 decades, uncertainty was high and confidence was low, and the federal government had run substantial deficits for over 20 years and was projected to run even greater deficits going forward. In that context, he consistently pursued job creation and higher standards of living for middle-income and lower-income Americans. And he did this through a strategy of public investment, deficit reduction, and international economic policy. President Clinton was also a visionary. He recognized what all of us know so well today, that the global economy was in the early stages of a transformation that would create enormous opportunities, but also great pressures. And that information technology and communication were on the threshold of revolutionary changes that would have enormous impact on our economy. He was committed to addressing our more immediate issues while also preparing the American people to succeed in a rapidly changing world. I remember an East Room speech where President Clinton said, "We cannot prevent change, we should not prevent change, but we can work to equip the American people to succeed in a rapidly changing global economy." Prior to taking office, President Clinton decided that in order to accomplish his goals, he needed a better process for decision-making. So he created a National Economic Council that was patterned after the National Security Council that President Truman had created in 1947. The NEC gave cabinet members and senior White House staff an honest broker forum to provide the president with the fullest possible input on the decisions that he had to make, and then to secure cooperative commitment to following through. The process was well suited to President Clinton's extraordinary decision-making capabilities. He recognized the immense complexities involved in virtually every serious issue. He saw decisions as judgments about probabilities, not certainties. He intensely pursued a fuller understanding of all the issues that came before him, and he went out of his way to seek the opinions of those who disagreed with him. Then he made the difficult decisions, and he worked unceasingly to implement the decisions that he had made. President Clinton's decisions reflected his powerful belief in market forces as the basic principle of our economy, but with an equally strong belief in the vital role of government to provide the underpinnings for a market-based economy and for regulation. And that critical role of government, the critical role that government played in the economic success of the 1990s, is a very important lesson to remember for today. More broadly, I remember President Clinton saying in the Oval Office one day that some people want John Wayne to ride up on a horse with a silver bullet, but that in reality our economic issues were many and complex, and that any effective economic strategy would have to be commensurately broad and complex. I will not attempt to touch on all of his major initiatives, but I will briefly mention what I see, at least, as the major components of his economic strategy. In 1993, as the film demonstrated so aptly, he won enactment of his seminal economic initiative. It combined strong deficit reduction with robust private investment in areas that were critical for competitiveness. As a consequence, long-run interest rates fell substantially, and very, very importantly, confidence increased because of reduced uncertainty about future economic policy and future economic conditions, and a heightened belief in the effectiveness of government. The large increases in public investment included the Earned Income Tax Credit, NIH funding, education, basic research, and so much else. And finally, the program was financed 50-50 with spending cuts and tax increases. As the film showed, our opponents said that the tax increases would lead to recession or worse. Instead, we had the longest economic expansion in the nation's history. President Clinton continued a robust investment, public investment, throughout his tenure. And he substantially furthered his fiscal objectives with the 1997 Balanced Budget Agreement, which built on the accomplishments of 1993. At the same time, President Clinton protected the programs that were so important to middle-income and lower-income Americans against vigorous attacks, including Medicare, Medicaid, CRA, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. On health care, he correctly identified the imperatives for universal coverage and for cost constraint. His overall program wasn't adopted, but on many fronts he made notable progress, including the Children's Health Insurance Program. He also accomplished welfare reform to provide support where needed and to end dependency when appropriate. On technology to prepare for the revolution just beginning, he extended broadband to rural areas, to schools, to hospitals, and he promoted basic research in technology and broke down the quasi-monopolies that then existed to provide a competitive environment for local telephone companies, cable TV, and the like. On the international side, he moved to address, quickly and effectively, financial crises which threatened us and the global economy, first in Mexico in 1995, and then in Asia and Russia in 1997 and 1998. On trade, he obtained agreements that were beneficial to the United States and also to our trading partners. He also, and I believe this was an historic accomplishment, reframed our relationship with China by helping bring China into the WTO. He held the view that engagement with China was the only structure that would be sustainable for the long term, and he also believed that engagement would best promote our economic and national security interests and would give us the best opportunity to pursue the human rights that are so basic to our society. Additionally, President Clinton recognized the integral connection between foreign policy and economic policy, and as a consequence, foreign policy officials and economic officials would work together to provide combined input on the issues that cross both arenas. The effect of all this was the longest economic expansion in our nation's history, 22 million new jobs, almost all in the private sector, rising incomes at all levels once the recovery took hold, an unemployment rate that fell to roughly 4%, enormous increases in productivity, and the first surplus in 30 years in 1998. Moreover, President Clinton worked to create a nation that was strongly positioned to face a technological revolution and the rapidly changing global economy. Just as President Clinton combined the lessons of past experience with bold creativity and innovation, President Obama is doing so today to soundly address the extreme difficulties he inherited, in many respects greater even than those President Clinton first faced, the continued hardship of so many Americans, and the nation's increasing income inequality, which is such a threat to our economy and to our social fabric. Both presidencies highlight a most fundamental point. Complex substantive issues can be effectively addressed through thoughtful policy development, even amongst those with different views. Ultimately, however, a successful economy requires an effective political system, with elected officials working across party lines to find common ground and making tough political decisions based on facts and analysis. Both President Clinton and President Obama embraced the view that our country has enormous long-term strengths and will succeed economically if we work together to meet our challenges. Let me finish by saying that I'm honored to have worked with so many outstanding colleagues as a member of President Clinton's economic team. It was an extraordinary experience for all of us to be able to work under President Clinton's leadership to do so much good for the American people. And that was an opportunity, Mr. President, for which I will always be grateful. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Honorable John Podesta, the Honorable Laura Tyson, the Honorable Bruce Reed, the Honorable Thurgood Marshall Jr., the Honorable Marjorie Margolis, and the Honorable Alan Blinder.
Good afternoon. I think my mic's working. Yeah, there it goes. Bob did a tremendous job of setting the table, but several of us were down in Little Rock a couple of weeks ago to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the announcement of Governor Clinton's campaign for the presidency. And I read the speech going down there, and it was eerily relevant to today. And I just wanted to add a bit to what Bob said and give you a sense of what President Clinton was coming into when he came into office. The country was facing what were then the biggest budget deficits in history. Maybe they seem small by comparison today. The economy was weak. Unemployment was rising to 7.5% from a base that was just under 7 in 1991. CBO expected the unemployment rate to stay above 6% for the first Clinton term. Just a month before the inauguration, the New York Times ran a headline, "Gloomy Prospect Seen for Growth Worldwide in '93." 15.1% of Americans lived in poverty a number that went down by a quarter under those 8 years and now is back up to 15.1%. College graduates were entering the worst job market in 20 years. 75% of Americans said they had little trust in Washington's ability to do what was right. And that was the America that that Governor Clinton was facing when he walked onto the stage in front of the old State House that day. And he promised to focus on the forgotten middle class, built his speech around a value framework which was familiar to all of us who worked for him, which was that he promised to build a society that would provide opportunity for all, expect responsibility from all, and build a community of all. And he also did something in the speech, and this is where I want to start, and I'm going to start with a question to Bruce. He was quite specific in the program that he was putting before the American public. He promised to modernize government, to challenge the bureaucratic status quo, to invest in people, education, and science and innovation. He promised to raise taxes on the wealthy and to cut taxes on the working poor in that first speech that he gave. And he laid out a plan for partnering with the private sector to grow the economy and strengthen communities. So, Bruce, as I said, I want to start with you. Normally, these announcement speeches are, I grew up in a log cabin, and, you know, this is who I am, and this is what kind of, they're kind of the vision thing is applied there. A values framework is given. But in this speech, and you worked on it and helped frame the campaign, it got quite deep and specific on policy. Why did you think you really needed to do that at that time, going into the campaign?
Well, as you said, John, the country was hurting, Washington was broken, and people wanted to know in specific terms, what are you going to do about it? We were in the midst of a recession. Probably even more important, we were coming off of a decade in which middle-class incomes had stagnated. College costs and healthcare costs were way up. People had a sense that the American dream was slipping away, and Washington wasn't up to the challenge. The administration didn't have a plan to deal with it. Congress, I suppose by today's standards, was wildly popular. Its approval rating was actually in double digits, but it was still in the teens. So voters were definitely in a show-me mode. They wanted to know exactly what the next president they hired was going to do to solve their problems, and Governor Clinton viewed this as a job interview, that he wanted to lay out the terms of the contract with the voters. So we had 3 speeches here at Georgetown which went into greater detail even than the announcement speech about what to do on domestic and economic and foreign policy. And I think the other reason that it was important to the campaign is that he had spent a lot of time thinking about what he wanted to do as president. He was ready to go. The economic speech, which we gave here, we treated all these speeches in the college tradition. We tried not to finish them until the night before. And the economic speech, we presented him with the draft. We were working out of Frank Greer's office about a mile from here. And there were about 10 of us around a table telling him, here's the speech you want to give. And we all had our advice on say this, say that. He listened for a while. Then he went off by himself and he wrote 15 things on a piece of paper that was the specific policies that he wanted to outline in the speech. He said, here, write it this way, and you and George can come see me at my hotel room in the morning at 6 o'clock. So we stayed up all night writing the next draft of the speech, showed up at 6 o'clock at his hotel room. He went through it and he said, oh, this is getting there. And then he pulled out his briefcase, which contained 50 memos from economists and other people he'd met around the country with other ideas that he thought we needed to do to turn the country around. And the speech was at 10, so we had it done by then.
Excellent. I don't think the president... It's good to be able to stay up all night, I think. Let me turn to you, Laura. Go through the campaign, successful, wins election in November of 1992. You're hit with 2 things. One I mentioned already, which is unemployment is creeping up now. and there's a big need to address the slow growth and the high unemployment rate in the country. And secondly, you're hit with a new forecast from OMB.
Yes.
That said that indeed the deficit wasn't going to be 290 billion, it was going to be more than 300 billion, and it was trending up to 1.8 trillion, I think, by 1998, right. If current policy stayed in place. You had an economic summit in Little Rock, and you had to make adjustments, or at least you had to think about those twin challenges of how did you get the economy going at the same time of controlling the kind of fiscal context for the country. How did you get the balance right, or how were you thinking about it in those terms? I think that's quite relevant to today.
Well, it's very relevant today, and it required some very tough choices because it really was a balancing act. We did try, and it's oftentimes forgot, we tried to do two things at once. And I think we need to keep bringing back the politics of the moment here, because we went out with a notion, which is actually very common in today's discussion of the economy, of pairing a package that would provide insurance for what looked like a weak, anemic, jobless, it was the first time people were using the word jobless recovery, high unemployment rate, not going down. So we came up with the idea of an insurance package of investment and tax incentives, short term, married to a multi-year balanced long-term deficit reduction package. And we went out with that idea. Frankly, that idea was an idea that I think had widespread support among the economics and business community. It did not garner widespread political support. During that entire period, as we were trying to do two things at once and explain how government had one role in terms of supporting recovery and another role in terms of addressing long-term interest rates and long-term growth, while we were doing that, we were focusing more and more of our time on, well, what is this long-term growth deficit reduction package going to look like? Because when you're putting something together, the size matters, the time matters, the composition matters. What's the breakdown between spending cuts and revenue increases? What kind of spending cuts? What kind of revenue increases? Now, the president had laid out in some of the speeches either he or Bruce wrote, or George, whoever wrote them, he had laid out his basic principles. We knew that that package was going to have significant amounts of investment where the cuts were not going to come from, because we wanted to invest in our future in things like research, training, education. But we also knew that this package from the very beginning was going to have a significant amount of revenue raising in it. And the revenue raising was going to have to be along with something else mentioned, but really underscored here, a very significant broadening out of the earned income tax credit, which was going to mean very significant relief for 22 million American families making $27,000 a year or less. That was to reward work and opportunity. We wanted to, that's a constant theme here. So we had to debate all of these things, and frankly, we had to debate them all in a situation where, and this is where probably his economic advisors drove the president a bit crazy, as all economic advisors do. He would reasonably say, okay, well, if we reduce the deficit by 10 billion, what exactly is going to be the decline in long-term interest rates? What exactly is going to be the decline in the unemployment rate? When is this going to occur? How fast is this going to occur? The models weren't and remain not that good. We couldn't answer those questions. We could say it has to be big enough to restore confidence. Investors have to believe in this. Americans have to believe in it, okay? It has to be long enough and gradual enough so you give time for interest rates to come down. They won't come down automatically. The growth effect isn't going to be tomorrow. It's going to be over several years. So we did a lot of discussion of what the package should be, the size, and I think coming up with the notion we're going to cut the deficit as a share of GDP in half. We're going to do it in a balanced way, about 50-50 spending and revenue, and we're going to do it in a really progressive way with that earned income tax credit, a very important part of this. But let's not forget, the revenues primarily came from the top 1%. This is the same discussion we're going through right now. It's just in 1993, with one vote, the Vice President's vote, we were able to get through a progressive balance package.
Alan, let me turn to you and kind of pick up on what Laura was saying, which is that, and Bob raised this in his opening comments, which was that there was a combination of kind of tightening fiscal policy, reducing the deficit, in order to be able to have more, perhaps, expansion on the monetary policy side, to lower interest rates, to get investment going. And I wonder how much of that was done only through the vehicle of these budgets, and how much was actually a conscious strategy that was worked through with Alan Greenspan and the Fed. Was there a real dialogue there, or were you just hoping for the effect that, as Gene Sperling noted, you saw almost immediately upon passage?
I think it was more a hope. I think there may have been some dialogue above my pay grade. There was certainly not any dialogue of that nature that I was privy to, and if there was any, it didn't amount to anything much. The Fed already had interest rates about as low as it was going to go. It was kind of chomping at the bit, as President Clinton will remember, to raise interest rates as quickly as it could. And I think what we were hoping for and got was that if we delivered a package of deficit reduction of sufficient size and sufficient credibility, this is really, really important, if I could take another minute on that in a second, sufficient size and sufficient credibility, the Fed would hold off a bit longer before it finally would raise interest rates, which turned out to happen about a year into the Clinton administration. And in addition, this to go right back to Laura's point, we had at least some hope of tripping off a bond market rally. This was the origin of Carville's famous remark. I'm sorry, I was late, I missed the clip. Was that on the clip?
No, it wasn't on the clip. So
that he wanted to come back as the bond market so he could terrorize everybody. and we had discussion after discussion, going back to Little Rock and then into the White House, of what might happen with the bond market, what we could do to the package to make it stronger in terms of getting a good bond market reaction. And of course, only Bob Rubin actually knew it to the basis point. If I could take a minute more about the credibility. We came into office in January 1993 with a financial market, the bond market for short, that had been growing both used to and extremely tired of blue smoke and mirrors on the budget. This had been going on for year after year after year. There was very little credibility of government announcements at all about what the future of the deficit would be. It's a little bit like Greece today. It's very hard to get people to believe promises about Greece and Italy. It was about that hard, not quite, but almost that hard to get them to believe promises about the US. So we did a number of things, I think half consciously, half unconsciously, to try to cement, there was no such thing as guarantee, the credibility of the package that we'd eventually come up with. And the first was to use honest numbers without gimmicks. Gimmicks had just been part of the game, and I think it's fair to say that we had orders from the top of the house not to use gimmicks, and we were not inclined to use gimmicks anyway, and that itself was a refreshing thing to the financial markets. It was also necessary, I think, to take a few sacred cows out for prominent slaughter, cut a few things that Democrats are not supposed to cut. Like, for example, one of those revenue raisers was to increase the taxability of Social Security benefits at the top, not at the bottom, but at the top. That was a surprise. I don't think anybody thought a Democratic administration would do something like that. And then also, I think it was very important not to oversell and overstate what we expected to achieve. So we didn't come in claiming miracles were going to happen from this. President Clinton, who remembers everything, may still remember that we had a little internal fight about the forecast we were going to use over the next several years. We internally in what those of us that did it around the table called the pizza forecast, because it was done with a lot of pizza boxes strewn along, were more optimistic over the budget window, which in those days was 5 years, not 10 years, than the CBO. And you wouldn't expect a decision like this to go all the way to the presidential level, but it did. And there was finally a decision by the president himself, hearing the warring factions within his team, to go with a CBO forecast, which was more pessimistic than we thought. And by the way, our forecast was ludicrously pessimistic compared to what we actually got. As the person principally responsible to the forecast, I confess it was a horrible forecast. And had we actually forecast what came true over the next 5 years, we'd have been laughed right out of town, and the bond market would have tanked because the crazy people had taken over in Washington. But we did exactly the opposite of that, and I think we were, if anything, understated about the achievements that would flow from the budget deficit, what we hoped would be a budget deficit agreement, and wound up an agreement of sorts. And I think that helped with the credibility.
The budget plan gets put together over the course of the spring. It's sent up to the Hill, ends up passing both houses. Goody, you were working for Vice President Gore, but you were principally up on the Hill. Was there any hope in putting that deal together of trying to actually extract Republican votes to come to the middle? Bob talked about extending, or I guess Jack DeGioia talked about trying to find ways to extend hands across the aisle. But in putting the package together and then in lobbying for it, it obviously passed only with Democratic votes and with Vice President Gore breaking the tie in the Senate. Did you ever imagine getting Republican votes for this package?
Well, despite your typically skeptical tone, we did. We very much thought we could.
I just live and learn.
Yeah, we all do from you. And we had put a number of points up on the board early on with bipartisan support. Family medical leave come to mind, motor voter comes to mind. We were working very closely with the Republican leadership in both chambers, got a lot of assistance, for example, on nominations, and a lot of help informally, but a lot of bipartisan votes. Steve Ricchetti and a number of our cabinet members who are here know that on the budget, though, it was a bigger challenge. It quickly became fairly partisan. And we had one additional challenge dealing with the Hill during that first year. In the House in particular, we had nearly half of the Democratic caucus either was in the first term or a second term. So we had education challenges. And frankly, what helped us there was the message discipline that the president and the campaign had, particularly on the economy. So on the House side, we very much worked center out, trying to hold Democratic moderates, but also targeting a number of Republicans in swing districts. Ultimately, I think we should have realized the writing was on the wall, at least on the economic issues, when we had members like the dean, one of the Republican deans in the House, Henry Hyde, saying that on reflection, gridlock probably is a wise reaction to President Clinton's economic proposal. So we really should not have been as surprised on the House side. On the Senate side, which at least to that point had a history of a lot of bipartisan effort, we had a number of moderate Democrats to focus on, but we also had a number of Republican senators that were reasonable targets for us to be pursuing. We had, of course, Bill Cohen from Maine, who ultimately served as the president's defense secretary. We had Bob Packwood, who had even indicated that it would make sense to have some revenue provisions in the budget package, Mark Hatfield and others. But we had, as I say, a tough time just holding some of the moderate Democrats. And I remember on the night of the vote, the Vice President passed me a note to give to the Democratic leader, Senator Mitchell. It said, he's a moderate, it said, I'm wavering. But he ultimately, as the video told us, he ultimately voted, and as he liked to say, every time he votes, we win. So it was a good thing.
course, those were the ancient days when the majority still actually mattered in the Senate, right? Where 51 votes actually passed things.
Yeah,
Right.
51 votes mattered.
So we ended up having no capacity to get Republican votes for this budget package, and it fell to you, Marjorie, to have to cast what proved to be the deciding vote in the House of Representatives. You were coming new member in the maybe the toughest Democratic seat to be able to go and run on, and you knew that you might be giving up your seat when you cast that vote. Why don't you just set the scene for us and tell us what the pressure was like, what the vote was like, and how your colleagues reacted to it?
I'd like to tell you that the crazies have been breeding over the last 20 years. I represented the most Republican district represented by a Democrat in the country. As the president told me, it was the 14th rich, I did not know this until you told me this. It was the 14th richest district in the country. And I had a couple of problems with the bill, as most people could. I mean, I didn't think it did. It only tackled entitlements on the margins. The cuts were not deep enough, I thought. So that's what I said to my constituents. And during the whole day, I hadn't been asked because I was in this crazy, I was a freshman. And I walked to the floor that night, and the Republicans were high-fiving. And the Democrats were saying that they didn't know whether they were going to stick with the vote and everything like that. I think the president thought that I called him. I'm not so sure whether I called him, but I got on the phone with you. One thing I did not ask for was your firstborn. I swear. And I said to him, I couldn't believe I just couldn't believe what was going on. I couldn't believe that chairs of committees were voting against it. I couldn't believe that his member of Congress was thinking about voting against it. I was just shocked. I mean, I wasn't surprised. I was just shocked. I couldn't believe the behavior. So I said to him that I wouldn't let it go down. I had heard the talk on the floor. The Republicans said it couldn't go down. They weren't going to vote for it. Couldn't go down. Now, I told him that I would only be his last vote. I knew that there had only been 2 votes like that in history. One for Johnson's impeachment and for the draft. That was it.
World War II.
So I thought I was safe. But I said I would only be his last vote. And I think somehow nature protects, I don't remember a lot about it, but I think nature protects people who are in really bad accidents and who vote at 218. It was really a tough, I mean, I was taken underground to somebody's office to be safe. I was taken out of meetings from my constituents with police escorts. It was bizarre. Now, 1.2% of the population would be affected by a tax increase. They all lived in my district. And I can remember that the next day, that it was such a bizarre, it was really bizarre. The next day, I watched Bob Walker jumping up and down, saying, "Bye-bye, Marjorie." To that, he was, really, he was right. I thought he was a bit of a jerk. And he was a fabulous jumper. It was just an extraordinary experience. And you saw this guy jumping up and down saying, "Bye-bye, Marjorie." I really thought, when I was talking to the leadership, I said, you know, you're giving up the seat. We haven't had a Democrat, in the way that my district was configured, we hadn't had a Democrat like that ever. I won by 1,063 votes, who was counting. You're giving the seat up. So it was a combination of astonishment that the leadership hadn't pulled in some of these people and realizing that it had to happen. I had no idea what a good effect it would have. I just thought it was something that we had to do.
And ever had any regrets?
Well, you know, I I did a drive-by, no question about it. I mean, I just kind of came in and out. There are no regrets whatsoever. It just makes me, you look at what's going on and you say, gee, that's an issue I would like to sink my teeth into. So the fact that I'm not there sometimes comes to haunt me, but no, I absolutely no regrets whatsoever. It was so much. I wish people would not worry about staying. Now, that's an easy thing to say. You work so hard to get there. I wish people would say, okay, this is the movement we have to do. I'm not going to just be here to protect my seat. And that is absolutely not the atmosphere here. And I think it's the reason why the public thinks so, it thinks that what's going on in Washington is appalling. Because people feel that the members aren't sticking up for what they think is right.
Thank you. Laura, I want to get back to the core economics, and then I want to explore some of the other things that were done in the first year. But one of the things that I think Democrats were upset about was the ambition on the investment side had to be either scaled back, or there had to be people sense that there wasn't enough oomph, particularly in that first year. And I wonder, again, we're facing this challenge of both this tremendous fiscal overhang on the current budget deficit, but there was room for investments. How did you target those? Were there enough? What was the thinking of the administration kind of going into that?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that there are similarities between now and then, and there are differences between now and then. And an important difference now that we have to start with is then the long-term interest rate was high. We knew, as Alan said, that short-term rates were probably going to go up. We knew that the more we tried to provide some insurance, I would call it insurance oomph into that first year, the more we were substituting some private investment for public investment. But we had to be very careful, substituting public investment for private investment. We had to be very careful that we didn't unnerve the bond market, end up with higher interest rates, which would force out even more private investment. So one of the things in discussing investment in general is to recognize that there's public investment and private investment. What you want to do is have them complement one another. What you want to have them do is when the government sometimes can invest more because the private sector is holding back. So we kind of think of the notion of the government can encourage the private sector by investing in education, or investing in infrastructure, or investing in research, or providing some tax incentives for the private sector to invest. So the private sector needs to be energized to do more investment. That is a very important part of what we're in today, where aggregate demand is weak relative to the ability of the economy to produce, and having more government investment now could be very helpful. In 1993, it was complicated by the fact that again, the size. We didn't want to, we had to have credibility because we didn't want to unnerve the bond market. We didn't want to unnerve the private investment community that as the economy recovered, the government would be competing for resources. I mean, so in a sense, the balance is give the support to the economy a little bit when it's weak, but make sure you're sending a very credible signal that the government will be out of the way, moving back to create a room for private investment. Now, at the same token, I want to say the debate within the team, and it's been well documented, was really, I would say, more about the investment with the composition of the deficit reduction package itself. How much, if you're going to start with a balanced approach and you're committed to investing in education and training and research and infrastructure and community development, and you have an investment target you've set, and then all of a sudden you have to actually reduce those investments. You can't do it. You realize you've got to get the government scaled back so you can create room over the next 5 years for more private investment. So the biggest struggles, a lot of the big struggles internally were about, well, which of these investments that the administration would like to do in another world if the deficit numbers were better, which ones shall we cut back on? And I think there, the consistency of the message, to go back to Bruce, the consistency of the message that the president had laid out as a candidate helped us very much. Because there you say, all right, lifetime learning, education, very, very important. We are going to try to minimize the cuts there, or in fact to introduce new programs that address this problem in a different way. I think we spent a lot of time looking at the composition through the prism of the president's values. Rewarding work, I mentioned, the earned income tax credit. That was something where no matter how big the deficit reduction target was, you couldn't really look at that and say we're going to walk away from that. So you had to look for tougher things, which, as Alan pointed out, in looking for a tough, unexpected thing like increasing taxes on high-end Social Security recipients, we were actually adding credibility. So we were protecting investments in education, protecting the expansion of the earned income tax credit, trying to get to that big deficit reduction number, and also finding the revenues to do that. Now, let me just say one other thing, because it hasn't been brought up, and I remember having a conversation with the president about this, and it does show, again, the political constraints. At some point in the spring, the Democrats in the Senate in particular locked on to a number and basically said, we will not vote for your plan if it's $1 less than $500 billion of deficit reduction over 5 years. A quite meaningless number from an economic point of view. 480, 450, 500 in our economy over 5 years was not going to make an economic difference, but boy, the politics, unbelievable. Now, to get the $500 billion, and protect the kinds of essential investments which were consistent with the president's core values, which we were going to do. We had to scale back some of them. But one of the things we had to do is we had to go to a policy which the president really didn't like and his economic advisors didn't like at all, which was to make the tax increases on the people who lived in Marjorie's district retroactive. Retroactive. That's not good economic policy, and we knew it wasn't good economic policy. But on the other hand, we believed in the package as a package, and you couldn't get it through without the $500 billion number, and we didn't want to economize on some of the essential investments in CRAs and health and education that we were committed to. So that's the kind of balancing act that was required.
Bruce, let me turn to you. President DeGioia mentioned that the New Covenant speech was given here 20 years ago. That was, I went back and looked at that one too. That was full Jesuit. You know, Father Quigley being quoted. A lot of what the meat of that speech arced around the other side of the equation, the call to the citizens of this country for responsibility from them, a kind of call to action, a call maybe to sacrifice, but really to be good citizens and to do what they could to build their communities. Did those pieces in your mind work together? Were they on the same wavelength? Did one support the other in terms of the political ability to sell a new role for government in terms of its investment structure? I think they did. I think they reinforced one another. Keep in mind, there was a fundamental breakdown of trust in every institution. The S&Ls had failed, Washington had failed. People had just lost trust in government's ability to do its job, and they'd been told by Republican presidents repeatedly that government couldn't run a two-car funeral, as the president used to say. And so there was just inherent suspicion about whether they could trust what we were going to do.
So one of the things that we had to do was build back that trust. And that meant, as the president said, responsibility begins at the top. We had to ask a lot more of ourselves. We had to commit to spend less. We cut back on perks. We did a number of things to try to restore confidence in Washington. But it also meant, as he said in his announcement speech, that opportunity and responsibility had to be linked, that you couldn't promise to do, you couldn't make people a bunch of promises without asking them to do their part in return. And I think that was really a breakthrough in progressive thought. It brought back the Roosevelt tradition that there's no free lunch, that if you want an affirmative role for government, an expansive affirmative role for government that's up to the scale of the problems we face, you also have to ask people to make the most of it and to do their part. And so I think that what the president did on national service and on welfare reform and in other areas where he was asking people to do their share of the load helped a lot, because and it was true of the private sector as well. These were the decline of the middle class was beyond the capacity of Washington acting on its own to solve. We needed a collective effort from the whole country.
One of the elements that was most controversial, maybe most controversial amongst Democrats, most popular amongst the public, was welfare reform. Yes. And I've written about this and defended this as focusing on the centrality of work to organize people's lives. But it was a tough sell to some extent on Capitol Hill, particularly amongst our Democratic friends. Goody, you were up there working the issue, and there had been the experience of, particularly amongst previous presidents who used it as a kind of racial divisive issue. In the end of the day, how did you bring Democrats on board in order to support what became a comprehensive welfare reform proposal?
Well, there's a little irony in how that works, because I think part of the answer is that when we had loyal core supporters threatening to abandon us and indeed ultimately leave the administration in some cases, that I think brought some added credibility as we sought for votes to support on the center. I think it also should be said that we got a little more help from the Republican side than we might have anticipated at the time. But part of that is due to the fact that at that point, at the point at which welfare reform came along, I think we had much more credibility in terms of our ability, the administration's ability to predict outcomes. And it particularly goes back, frankly, to what the president said would flow from the 1993 budget plan.
Well, of course, we had an expanding workforce, too, which absorbed a lot of people into the workforce. Marjorie, you've talked about your district and the fact that the high-end tax cuts, the tax cuts on raising the rates on the wealthiest Americans, were concentrated in the district. There were a couple of other provisions in that bill, one of which I think was controversial as it was being debated, which was raising the gas tax, which was the one tax that broadly hit the middle class. I wonder how much that was. Do you think that was a factor in the politics that succeeded? We ended up losing the House in 1994. I mean, there were a lot of factors. This was one of them. But how much do you think people couldn't tolerate that small increase in the gas tax in order to?
I just think it was a good argument. It had no shelf life whatsoever, but it was a very good argument. As I would go into these meetings and talk about entitlements and all those kinds of things with these big signs saying "liar." It's a lovely atmosphere. That was brought up in my district. It was brought up very rarely. It was an argument on the floor that night. It was Ray Thornton's argument in the end when Ray decided not to vote for it. He said, "I just can't vote for a 4.3 cent a gallon gas tax." So it didn't resonate as much as the tax increase. At least it didn't the people didn't turn out concerned about that. And then as the as it progressed, it completely lost steam.
I remember Secretary Benson sitting in meetings and saying, this is the way to go because nobody will remember this in a year. And there's been a debate over the years about
but I can remember a lot of Democrats saying, if it goes to 4.6%, I can't vote for it.
Right, right.
I mean,
That's
it was stunning, you know, that we were going to lose at least, I mean, I think it was 7 votes, because if it went from 4.3 to 4.6, it was tipping the scale.
I believe the CEA in its usual form was suggesting ridiculous numbers like 10 cents. Yeah. And we're being looked at as, well, you guys go back and do your models again because this isn't going to work.
Al?
You may remember, John, that we actually started this process with a much more sensible energy tax proposal, a BTU tax, which was going to raise not a gigantic, but a meaningful amount of revenue. That got whittled down, cut to pieces, and finally abandoned into this, and the heir apparent was this truly puny gasoline tax. Marjorie is remembering this very well. I remember, without naming names, there was at least one vote we were going to lose in the Senate on 4.3 versus 4.6 or 4.7, and we didn't have a lot of spare votes in the Senate. Al Gore wasn't given 2 votes to take up there. You know, to us economists, this was completely crazy. And I do remember Lloyd Benson saying exactly what you remember, John. He said, who in the world is going to remember a year from now whether we raised the gasoline tax 4.7 cents or 4.3 cents? As we all know, you go to the pump and it moves more than that in a day.
Right.
Has nothing to do with taxation. But this became a kind of a shibboleth. I think Marjorie's right. I think people that were looking for a reason to be against the package, to accuse President Clinton and the Clinton team in general of being tax happy and so on, sort of just latched on to this completely trivial thing. The upper income bracket taxes were not trivial. It raised a serious amount of revenue. This was really, really completely trivial, especially when you get down to tenths of a penny, but it really was there. And the thing came really close to foundering on a few tenths of a cent on the gasoline tax.
Alan, our conservative friends, critics, sometimes like to argue that, particularly on the fiscal consolidation side, that you did some things, but this was all, you just rode the internet bubble up. You've studied this in great depth. I wonder if you would comment on whether you think the macroeconomic approach here actually resulted in the deep deficit reduction than the creation of surplus.
I think the charge that you got, if you take it to the level, you guys really did nothing significant and the internet bubble did everything, is just wrong on its face. That said, if you go to later in the period, get into 98, get into 99, and ask, how did we get this tremendous surge of revenues and actually turn deficits into surpluses? It was not really the 1997 budget agreement, good as it was. It was in large measure the tremendous capital gains revenues that flowed from the stock. Let's just call it the stock market bubble. It wasn't only the internet, but prior to that, unless you just want to close your eyes to reality and write a fantasy history, there could be very little doubt that the early bond market rally in the early part of the Clinton administration was tied. You could sort of see it in events as things were announced, as things were voted up, as things were voted down. The market's going up and down on these votes. And unless you just want to rule that out of your thought process, it's as plain as the nose on your face early on. Now, I said that we didn't want to overstate our likely achievements when we had this 5-year budget plan in 1993. We were not forecasting a surplus by 1998. No. It never crossed our mind in 1993 that we would get that. It never crossed our mind that the unemployment rate would get down to 3.9%. And as I indicated before, if we had written that in the plan, they'd have thought we were a bunch of loonies. And these things did happen, and the tech bubble had a lot to do with them happening. And so at the end, there was some of this riding of the wave, for sure.
Probably keeping the unemployment rate under 5% and having real wages growing may have had something to do with it, too.
Whenever I'm talking about this, the blowback is, well, the reason we saw this in the 90s is because the Republicans took over. Thank you.
These are the same Republicans that used to ridicule Al Gore for, quote, inventing the internet, which of course he didn't do, but he was a big proponent of pushing it forward.
I think the 2001 budget puts in perspective their fealty to balanced budgets and fiscal discipline. We are out of time, but I want to give Bruce, since you actually are sitting in a position of power and authority now, the final word on what's the takeaway from all this for you?
I think the most important lesson, perhaps, of Clintonomics is that it's possible to cut and invest at the same time. You know, for decades, the two parties have been arguing you have to do one, have to do the other. President Clinton's view was, if you're worried about the competitiveness of the country over the long haul, you need to spend more on the future and less on the present and the past.
Okay. Well, join me in thanking a terrific panel and thanking Marjorie for saving the Republic.
Very inspiring.
Thank you all for being here today, and many thanks to this distinguished panel for coming the long distances all of you did to be a part of this. I also want to thank John's panel. I think you all really gave us a great sense of the budget battle of 1993 and how that framed President Clinton's early years and really set the tone for the broader struggle to drive growth and opportunity and jobs throughout the 1990s. I know I remember the President's acceptance speech at the 1996 Democratic National Convention when he spoke about seeing his job as building that bridge to the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Now, for a lot of people, that was new information. For those of us in this panel, it was old news. Every day, I think, he came and talked to us about his central organizing mission of his presidency. And that was to manage this transition between the Cold War industrial mindset that had dominated thinking since the 1950s to a new platform. And that platform would embrace change, and it would embrace a spirit of innovation, which I think helped create a lot of that new technology that came out in the 1990s, and it would empower America to compete and compete successfully in what is today a knowledge-based global economy in the interdependent world of the 21st century. Well, you guys all had the responsibility of taking this visionary's vision and making it real. You ran the departments, you ran the agencies, and you had to set up the goals, the objectives, and timelines to make it real. Let me start with Gene. Gene, can you give us a sense, since you were so heavily involved in not only the policy, but also the execution of the challenges of governing when the economy was evolving so dramatically?
Well, you know, I think as Bruce said, I mean, the president had for us, you know, a fairly clear three-part frame, which was the need to restore fiscal discipline, trust in government. Secondly, to have an aggressive investment in the future, which was very much based on his vision of the transformation into the 21st century, skills, technology, innovation. And then that third, which was to embrace globalization with a human face, which was the president's expression. I think rightly foreseen that this actually became harder after we left, as as the globalization put more pressure on the tensions between competition, a fierce supply chain, and being able to establish that that was working to lift families and workers as opposed to a race to the bottom. And I think he really foresaw that, and I think it infused everything we did. As you know more than anyone, Erskine, the first thing we had to do was obviously get the balanced budget agreement. And it's kind of interesting. If you look at what Alan and Laura were talking about, they did, you know, Vice President Gore used to always love to say that the 1993 deficit reduction was the one example of the law of intended consequences. We actually thought this could lead to an investment-led recovery, that there'd be a drop in interest rates, that there was an uncertainty that if overcome could fuel investments. When I became NEC director at the end of 1996, beginning of 1997, succeeding Bob and Laura, we faced a little bit of the opposite, which was the markets had now assumed that there would be a balanced budget agreement. And so what I would hear from people is, if you fail, there will be a negative surprise, that interest rates were low, that there was enormous confidence that even though the president, you know, I believe actually, the president probably believes this too, that had Steve Forbes not surged in the primaries in '96, President Clinton would have cut the balanced budget deal with Bob Dole in the spring of '96. But we had to come back in '97. So we had the pressure essentially to maintain the confidence and not have the negative surprise of not getting the balanced budget agreement. So that was, I think, our, you know, the first thing we had to do. But in doing that, you know, for us, obviously, it's never just getting the budget right. We wanted to, again, infuse those values. We got the first child tax credit, and as you know, we did it in a way that it benefited lower income, earned income tax credit recipients, increasing that vision of rewarding work. We were able to get the first major expansion of healthcare through the CHIP program as part of that. So that was the fiscal side. On the open market side, I think that's where the president very much succeeded, but I think he felt frustrated at times as well, because he wanted to be able to put together this compact more robust, that with open markets would come a more serious development in poorer countries and a more significant investment in workers and training. And I think we pushed in those areas as far as we could, but it was never quite at his vision. And I think one of the reasons that he went to Davos at the end was to make sure people understood the full depth of our vision, but we pushed in every way we could. On the international side, if it was AIDS, if it was child labor, we pushed where we could. We did get the one-stop shopping worker training programs that are across this country came in 1997. It was not as robust, but it was, we always had that sense we were pushing in that direction. You had to have the training, you had to have the education. That had to be part of both the investment budget, the investment sense, as well as the globalization with the human face. And I think that, you know, we also saw very much in everything we were doing that we were not only doing the kind of normal education accountability standards, but we were looking for the education that was connected to the, you know, as you say, bridging to the 21st century. And, you know, we discovered things we could do. We couldn't get a new authorization, so we took existing authorizations and we built up a huge technology initiative to close the digital divide. And we got it up to $750 million, and we made great progress in areas like that. The basic notion that the president, with Iron Magaziner's help, took a very hands-off development of the internet was one of the huge things that happened. And over again, CEOs would say to me, I never in a million years would have thought that you could have an innovation like this and that the government would know when to keep their hands off and let it develop. So it was very much that vision. And the last thing I'll say, because you have so many people up here, I'll give the president credit for this. The president didn't really like this concept of the NAIRU, which was that there was a rate of unemployment that could only go down to, at the time, Laura, right, 5.5% to 6% without fueling inflation. So we did an intervention. It was the only intervention I remember on the economic team. Bob came, we got Larry, who had mostly been working on international policy, Laura, and we came in to say, you just have to stop saying this. At 5.5% inflation goes up, every economist says this, and the president said, yeah, like I know that's what you guys think, but you're wrong. And Larry Summers and I have debated whether was the president actually have an insight or was he just lucky? And I actually think that there was, I think it was actually kind of an interesting thing. When a new rule book is being written, when the old rules are changing, who would know? In a strange way, the President of the United States, who is meeting constantly while the rest of us are back at home having meetings, he's out there talking every day to the entrepreneurs. He's talking. And I think he had a sense, before most of us did, that there was something happening in how people were managing inventory, the supply chain. And he would come back and say, you're not talking to the people I am. And I think he very much did foresee that something profound was happening. And going to Alan's point, of course, presidents always get both more credit and more blame than they'll deserve in the economy. But that's not the real issue. The issue is, do you push in the right directions? Do you lay the foundations? You laid the foundation of economic confidence. You laid the foundation of fiscal discipline. You laid the foundation that this was an administration that wanted to promote the super information highway, that you wanted to support globalization and find a way to do it. Those are the things that lay a foundation. And you make your luck. And I think in '93, which you talked about, there was a tipping point moment where things could have gotten worse, or you could fuel a positive cycle that turned out to be fantastic. But you have to judge a president and their term by with the hand they were dealt. Did they move things in the right direction? Did they lay the foundation? And I think when you look at those three fundamental priorities in shifting the economy to the 21st century, I think that there are things that we are dealing with that turned out to be harder after we left in globalization. We certainly didn't have to deal with the worst recession since the Great Depression. But I think for the hand we were dealt, what the president laid out as our organizing principle and what we focused on absolutely helped produce what was an unprecedented period of shared growth, shared income growth, shared prosperity over the last 100 years.
I remember when we were negotiating the bipartisan balanced budget in 1997, and President Clinton never saw that as an arithmetic exercise. He wanted to balance the budget, but he always told us we have to balance it in the right ways with our priorities. And I can remember coming back to the Oval Office after one of the final negotiations with Gingrich and Lott. And to get that done, I had to spend months and months locked up with Gingrich and Lott, and you owe me a lot for that. But I remember telling him, he said, did you get it? And I said, yes, sir, we did. And when we got the expansion of the earned income tax credit to make work pay, and we got health care insurance for 5 million poor kids, he just put his arms around us and said, that makes a difference in people's lives. And that's what drove this economy, and it drove it in the right way. Nira, one of the things that you worked on in the Domestic Policy Council and as senior advisor to the First Lady was the whole education reform effort. And President Clinton did so many great things in education reform, from the direct student loan program to creating real public school choice, going from one charter school when he came into office to 2,000 when he left. But what I thought was amazing, he was the first politician I ever met that truly understood the juxtaposition between education and economic development. Talk to us about what he did there and what his policies were and what the effects were.
Well, I think you mentioned 2 initiatives, but one thing I wanted to focus a little bit on and come back to those is, what was remarkable is that the president had an experience as governor that helped shape his views of education. And, much of the work we did was really focused on the work that he had done as governor in 1989, really focusing the country's attention in a bipartisan way on high standards. And the movement that we've had over the last 20 years to ensure that we're raising our standards in schools for everybody, that we're ensuring that we can compete in the global economy because we are focused on ensuring that those standards are moving in the right direction, that there's more and more public pressure to raise them up and not lower them, really got started over 20 years ago by the president when he was governor, and something he carried through in his work on Goals 2000. And so, and obviously education is a partnership between the state and federal government, state, local, and federal government. The federal government's role is more limited, but I think what was remarkable was that we changed the conversation around education from being something simply about local schools and state budgets as a national enterprise, because, as Jean mentioned, the president saw these investments as part of the way the United States would compete in the global economy. And I think just one point to mention about sort of the different visions that we're seeing today with these kinds of investments in the future is, you know, the president was confronted in 1995 in the budget negotiations with the Republican Congress with a strategy that is similar to the Republican strategy today, which is to cut everything and thereby grow the economy. And he stood strong against that initiative, stood strong against that effort, and we were able to see we were able to maintain those investments and kids in our future, as well as grow them in the future. And I think part of the reason why we had the growth we did was obviously because of the tremendous foresight of the president's 93 plan, but also a rejection of the 95 budget that the Republicans wanted to adopt. And I'm thankful. And I think when we look around the world today, we see that that budget strategy is a disaster for other countries like Britain and would have been a disaster for us as well.
President Clinton always talked to us when he talked about education, about it was the key to the future of the country, that if you didn't have a highly educated, highly trained workforce, there was no chance that we could succeed in what would be a knowledge-based global economy. And he stressed to us so many times that if you set your standards here, that's what you'd get. But boy, if you set them here, people would perform beyond even their own expectations. Rodney, in your work at the Department of Transportation, you know, maybe this came from his time as governor, but you know, most people in public life, when they talk about infrastructure, talk about a bridge here or a road there, but President Clinton, you know, saw it more as a broader approach. Describe to us the approach he brought to infrastructure and how that helped the economy grow and create jobs.
Sure. Well, clearly he saw it as more than concrete, asphalt, and steel, but actually access to opportunity, whether that's a good education, a good job, health care, but access. And he used transportation themes and images metaphorically all the time, the bridge to the 21st century. I think one of the key challenges for us at DOT was to come in line with that broader vision of transportation, so that we would be talking about more than just concrete, asphalt, and steel. And I think we were able to accomplish that by actually, you know, getting no's from you on a number of accounts, if I may, Mr. President. You wouldn't know this from your cabinet officials, but we tried to influence your State of the Union address. And we usually want to have something that we're working on mentioned in that State of the Union address. Well, I tried that with Erskine to, in one sense, no avail as relates to my approach to try to get a project mentioned, you know, and it could be a big project, the Big Dig in Boston or the Alameda Corridor connecting the two ports of Long Beach and LA and California, and their importance to our global economy. And it was just no, no, no. But then he came back to me with something, and this is in the 1998 State of the Union address, where it says that there has been a new approach to getting our economic house in order. And it's getting the budget right, but also strategically investing in those things that will take us into the future. Education, healthcare, the environment, technology, and transportation. Now that was a win for us because what we did was we took your State of the Union address and we basically mirrored all of the things that we were working on at transportation to connect with those initiatives. So with welfare to work, we were the 2 in welfare to work. Access to jobs, right? Many of those individuals in urban communities having to get to jobs in suburban or rural areas. So that's how we made transportation resonate. The other thing, too, now is that we sought to go beyond just the political team that you established at DOT and to actually connect with all of those career staff members. And when you're talking about a staff at DOT then of 100,000, that's a lot more than the political staff. And we made the case to them that we were going to try to get their numbers, meaning the bills passed that we need. But at that time, we hadn't passed T21 or Air 21, the major aviation bills or the surface transportation bills. But we had to get them to buy in. And what we said to them was, we are at the table, not on the periphery. We are there with the discussions about education and healthcare and the environment and technology and transportation. And we want you to help us make sure that with that opportunity, we've got something to say. And so we actually engage the career staff to work with us as a political staff to think anew about transportation and to really make the case that it's about more than concrete, asphalt, and steel, but it's literally the means by which we pursue happiness, by which we get to a quality educational opportunity, a quality job opportunity. And sometimes it is the way that we envision difficult decisions that have to be made. So in the words of Frost, it's the 2 roads diverge in the yellow wood. In the words of James Weldon Johnson, it's the stony roads we trod. And by approaching it that way, not only did we gain a seat at the table, we were able to pass all of our major legislation. We also took seriously the strategic plan initiative of reinventing government, the performance plans initiatives, and ours were rated #1 in government because we took the effort seriously. And we said, with this opportunity to be at the table, let's make sure that we have earned every right to be there.
And Erskine, I can see both Don Baer and Michael Waldman there, and they are shocked to learn the cabinet members were trying to influence the State of the Union. I can see it on their faces.
That did not happen today either.
Yeah, I learned that pretty early that one of the key roles of the Chief of Staff was the word no. Yes. You're right, Rodney. The President always wanted to make sure, he wanted us to be fiscally responsible. He wanted us to drive a balanced budget. But he said, you have to remember, we have to invest in the future. We have to build that bridge to the 21st century. We must invest in education. We must invest in infrastructure. And one of the infrastructure projects that he talked about a lot was stuff that Bob Rubin brought up, was investing in broadband access to the internet. I remember him calling it the farm-to-market infrastructure of the 21st century. And he also said we had to invest in high value-added research because that would create the jobs of tomorrow. Henry, you had a kind of rough go there for a while when the President talked about the era of big government is dead. And you were able to effectively manage such that we were able to do more with less in housing. Tell us how you did it.
Well, Erskine, when you talk about the bridge to the future, you know, that's a kind of a concept of chronology because it was thought of as bridging to the next century. But there was always, to me, a frame in the President's spirit and logic and history that was about social justice and fairness and sharing and the civil rights agenda that makes us Democrats. Democrats are Democrats because they are the children of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. and of the Great Society and President Johnson, President Kennedy's articulation of it, of Martin Luther King. And I had had the opportunity to visit with the president for a lot of years. He would come to San Antonio to make speeches in the years that I was mayor, and I got to know him, and then he invited me to Arkansas. And Hillary did too, to work on some healthcare and clinic issues in rural areas. And I always understood this was a person who was articulating a different kind of way to bridge the growth issues and the economic issues and involve the social justice agenda. So I was honored to take on the responsibility he gave me of being his outreach to the cities, which are so troubled. But I always felt there was, in Clintonianism, if you will, a kind of a two-fisted agenda. I used to talk about it as, you know, a good boxer doesn't have one punch, but at least two punches. And one punch was what we've been talking about in the last panel, which is growth. Democrats were not good at talking about growth. Republicans were thought to be better at managing the economy generally. But as you heard in the last panel, the Rubin, Benson agenda, if you will, of getting to balance and fiscal responsibility with a thrust for growth was clearly key in one of those punches. But it made possible the second punch, which is, how do you then make that work for people? It's not growth for its own sake. It's not GDP just to watch it grow. It's to make it work for people. It provides the wherewithal for those students who are present. It provides the wherewithal so that you can make other things happen, and it's not just social programs, but it's ways to make the economy reach people. So programs like manpower training and school performance that we've been talking about, and college financial aid, and in my bailiwick, home ownership, to give people the opportunity to build some wealth and have some net worth, and worker dislocation adjustments as people were lost jobs in one part of the country and needed to be retrained. And then systemic changes, not just programs, but systemic changes like changing the welfare program and changing the public housing system and focusing on teacher training and providing support in policing so that as crime came down in the cities, opportunities could be increased. So to me, these were always, you know, kind of two sides of a barbell. There's the growth agenda, but again, not growth for its own sake. It's to fuel the capacity to have these programs. And then these programs, we see them as essential to sustaining the growth itself. So the whole essence of Clinton-Gore Economics to me was always that, those two sides, working together, fit together. And then as you say, there were other elements to this that made it palatable, like the assignment the president gave to the vice president in reinventing government to figure out the, quote, third way of kind of what was discussed in those days as not rowing, but steering, using the sort of the current of growth and opportunity and steering it in the right directions. Those were all concepts, I think, that were well articulated by the president, vice president, and others.
And made an enormous difference. Mickey, you know, you had two big jobs in administration at USTR and at Commerce, and you were heavily involved in the passage of the free trade agreements and the negotiations with China that the president believed would bring new jobs and new opportunities to America. Talk to us about that and what kind of effect you think that had on the economy.
Thanks, Erskine. I'm just happy to be here. You knew I was going to say that.
Yes, I did.
Right. First of all, when Gene Sperling and I began the campaign in '91, we both were over 6 feet tall. I just want you to know that. So if any of you want to be short in stature, just work for Bill Clinton. That's the. I have two things I'm happy. First of all, I am so grateful to be again with my colleagues who I admire so much and learn so much from. You couldn't gather a finer group of people in one room, with the exception of me, ever. And I am grateful for that. Second, I am really grateful, and Bruce Lindsay will understand this, after 32 years of friendship, you have to sit and listen to me, President Clinton. let me just add a plank to this platform that's been laid out so well by both panels and so impressively. We were going to engage the world. If you look at the Georgetown speeches, all three of them, what runs through the three: opportunity, responsibility, community, of course, but engagement, the new world, globalization, we had to take advantage of it. Now, there are a number of ways to do it. First of all was balance our budget, bring people out of poverty, which we did from 15% to 11%, as I recall, the greatest reduction in poverty in the US ever in history at any time. Take the people in America who weren't doing well and let them grow. African Americans, over 30% growth in their income. Latinos, over 24% growth. Women did better than ever in history in our economy. Those were critical. Invest in technology, invest in infrastructure, invest in the programs, Henry, you were talking about. But what we had to do, once we were strong, how we were going to engage the world, build our markets, create jobs, be able to take advantage of this global economy. I'm going to tell one story that Bruce Lindsay and I were talking about earlier, President Clinton. In August 1992 in the campaign, you were faced with a very difficult decision. The question was whether you would say to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, no without labor and environmental agreements, or yes, but we will have labor and environmental agreements. Now that may sound like a nuance, it's not at all, because on that road probably whether Ohio and Michigan would go into the Clinton camp or not. And if Ohio and Michigan did not go for President Clinton, we were not going to win the campaign, because despite myself and Bill Clinton, we weren't going into Florida, if you remember that conversation. So that's what we had to do. We had many arguments about it. But I've got to tell you, this gentleman sitting in front of you has the guts most guts of anybody you've ever met, because he put his whole campaign on the line. He knew NAFTA was the right thing to do, Erskine. If we were going to engage the world, we had to start with our own hemisphere. And he said, yes, but we're going to have environmental and labor side agreements. We got them done. It's the first time in history any trade agreement had labor and environmental agreements attached to them. But that was the beginning of 300 trade agreements in the 8 years. I was lucky enough to have Charlene as my deputy, or I would have never gotten any of them, but that's another question. The fact is that if you're going to have a rules-based trading system, if you're going to have an open trading system, not free trade. Free trade's a misused and abused term. We need open, rules-based systems. Bill Clinton began talking about that in, well, long before 91, in 3 speeches here, President DeGioia. He talked about it again at American University in 1993, as I recall. He talked about it in 92 in Los Angeles at the World Affairs Council, and set the stage, not just for those of us who worked for him, but set the stage for the world to understand the U.S. was going to compete, not retreat. We were going to lead. And we now see what the product of that is. We're now the greatest trading nation on the face of the earth. We weren't when he started.
As usual, my job is to get this program back on time. We would like to, Neera, can you talk to us, though, before we go down, about health care a little bit and about the progress we made in health care and the effects that had?
Obviously, President Clinton put forward the Children's Health Insurance Program, and it was part of the budget deal that Gene and you all negotiated, and it was one of the most progressive hallmarks of the president's tenure, because it was the largest expansion of health care in 30 years at that time. And from its economic impact, it's really twofold. One is that we know a continuing challenge in the country is when the challenge we face today for many families is the biggest reason people go bankrupt is because of healthcare costs, and it obviously had a dramatic reduction in that, because family didn't have to go bankrupt because of their children's healthcare costs. It is hard to imagine that we did live in a country where children didn't have health insurance, but President Clinton righted that with his team. But most importantly, we forget, and I think this issue comes across in today's debates around these things, that the Children's Health Insurance Program, Medicaid, are vitally important to state budgets. When we're looking at the debates today, Medicaid expenditures and SCHIP are one of the best ways actually to help address some of our economic challenges, because the money gets spent very directly. And so when these programs are threatened, we should also recognize that we're not just cutting programs, but we're limiting economic growth. And I don't think that's exactly the reason why we did those programs. They were actually in keeping with what Secretary Cisneros mentioned, which is the importance of having not only economic growth, but policies that speak to how we should be as Americans and how we should solve challenges together as Americans, and also ensure that we are righting the injustices that are all around us. And I think if it wasn't for President Clinton and Hillary Clinton's work in '93 and '94 and the expenditure, the SCHIP, we wouldn't have had the progress we've made in healthcare since.
Erskine, I'd like to add a quick word. The president's not here now, so I can say this without seeming.
He's over there.
Oh, is he?
He just got out of your sight.
I want to say something. I wanted to say something that would sound like pandering if I said it with him sitting right here. But what I want to say is that a big part of the kind of economic leadership we had is just leadership. And that President Clinton, I think, and this is important for the students who are here, if there's a kind of a takeaway from a session like this, it is his natural instinct to be optimistic was an essential part of this program, okay? And a subset of that optimism was just a belief that you just have to work at it all the time. So when there was a temptation to maybe play a political card or take a shot at somebody or some other approach, right? His instinct was, let's do the right thing. Let's do the thing that'll work. It may be called small ball on an occasion, but let's do something. And I don't know how many times I heard him say, we just got to show up every morning and hit it fresh. And so what I'm saying is that you can't have an economic program in the abstract. It's not a dry thing on paper. It's fueled by the instincts, motives, and leadership capabilities of the person who's driving it. And we were lucky to have that in President Clinton. Yeah?
You're absolutely right, Henry. I can't count the number of times that President Clinton would come over from the East Wing of the White House. And for you all who don't believe that a president really knows what's going on in the country, he would read, gosh, dozens and dozens of magazines and newspapers, and he'd have some article that he'd torn out of a newspaper of some person in Oklahoma who'd gotten a raw deal, and he'd give that to me and he'd say, Erskine, go fix this. Because that's what he felt was his job every day, to wake up, to come over there every morning, and to make America a better place. And he didn't care how small or how big it was. He wanted to do something positive every day, and it was leadership in the finest way. Gene, will you close us down? The 90s were not a time where there was a lack of partisanship. People talk about a lot of tough partisanship today, but I've still got some scars that show through. Tell us what you attribute the progress, particularly on economic issues, that we made after the budget battle of 1993.
Well, you never want to look back with rosy-colored glasses. It was pretty brutal in '95, and we all know that. Of course, a lot of times people like to now say that what brilliant strategists we were on the government shutdown, except that we weren't trying to shut the government down. The president was trying to get an agreement. We were trying to work in that context, but we were smart, I think, strategically in letting people know that we were the reasonable ones trying to get an agreement. But we wanted to, and it was a serious negotiation, and the failure of the agreement was really the failure of Speaker Gingrich and them to be willing to move more to the center in the way that Bob Dole, I believe, would have been willing to do in the Senate. And it will always be one of my favorite moments of the presidency that the president was willing to shut the government down. And it was really over the discussion. Everybody thinks it was Medicare, but it was actually the Medicaid discussion with the Majority Leader Army that day is when the president said, I don't care if, you know, it all comes down around me or we go down to 5%. We weren't going to do the block granting and cutting of Medicaid. And that led to the government shutdown. Of course, I don't think any of us knew for sure how that would turn out, and it was not our goal. It wasn't some great political strategy. But I do think that the public responded by essentially punishing the party they thought were the most recalcitrant. And what was at least nice about the time then was people seemed to actually care about public opinion. It's really, in retrospect, kind of refreshing that when people were moved, they did respond. And I think that by the end of 1996, when we started the second term, there really was, what was great about that period was at that point, the president wanted to get a balanced budget agreement, and he was willing to, regardless of the politics, do that. And you had, I think, a Republican majority at that point that essentially did want to get well by showing they could work with this president. And I think that forged that moment where there really was, among the leadership, a sense of mutual self-interest in wanting to get there. And President Clinton said to me recently, remember that that seemed kind of hopeless in September, October of '95, and yet the whole mood turned around. Obviously, you would hope that would be a lesson for right now, that while it seems that there is a portion of the House of Representatives that is immune from public opinion, that could turn around and and should give us some hope. I do think the one experience we'd had, and it is very relevant to today, even though it doesn't always work, is the history of getting difficult bipartisan agreements is really when you get the leadership of both sides and both houses in a room. It doesn't always work, as you saw over the summer, but it's the only chance you have. The '93 experience, one thing from '93 that was maybe not the best phrase, but it's you got BTU'd. You took a difficult vote in the House of Representatives, and then the other house decided to not even put that forward. So you took a difficult political vote, you put your butt on the line, and then it didn't even happen. Members of Congress are very conscious of that. They don't want to take a difficult vote, put their careers on the line, and then find out that the other house is not even going to bring it up. So what we did in '97, where we first had the process with yourself and myself and Frank and Raines and John Hilley, where we met with Domenici and Kasich and the Democrats, we were all there. And what that allowed for, the same thing that happened in 1983 with Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, is a moment where you can hold hands and jump together, where you reach an agreement and everybody knows, I know there will be political cover on both sides, and I know both houses support that. So whether or not the negotiations over the summer bore fruit, whether the supercommittee bears fruit, that is still the most promising way to get an agreement. And I think 97 really showed that. I think the other positive is when that does happen, you do build a bit of personal trust. And that can seem hard to believe at times when people are such tough adversaries, but you do work together, and that does create, windows that open. I think the fact that sometimes we had to work together on some of the trade agreements built a certain rapport. I think that rapport allowed us, for example, when we passed the new markets tax credit, to reach out to Speaker Hassert and pass something in 2000 in an election year with the support of the Speaker of the House that's meant tens and tens of billions of tax incentives for investment in the low-income communities that Henry sought to fuel as Secretary of HUD. So I think that we went through the worst, and you can't always solve it in the room. But I think it's right to be on the side of trying. I think in the end of the day, I always think the public ultimately are like parents in the front seat when their kids are arguing in the back seat. When you're the kid in the back seat, you actually think your parents care, whether you're, who had the better side. Actually, the parents just want you to get along. And I think ultimately the public really does want all of us to work together. And if you can make clear of that, I think as President Clinton showed in '95, you may not bear the fruits of that immediately, but over time, I think the public rewards those who are trying to bring everybody together, who are willing to compromise, don't see that as a dirty word. And again, just to make the point, you almost had a balanced budget agreement in '96. That's how quickly things turned from October, November of '95 to the president. You should have seen the president, Bob Dole, sitting alone in the Oval Office with their little notepads doing the numbers. They were literally cutting the deal alone until politics took Bob Dole away from doing that. That turned, but ultimately it did create the environment in '97 where we started the year with a very clear mission. We knew, as you know, Erskine, we had one goal: get a bipartisan agreement. And so it can take a while. Maybe it can take half a year, but that's the mission. And I think what happened between '95 and '97 under President Clinton's leadership is, I hope, will be the a model for what will happen in this period of time as well.
Well, nothing in the world positive happens without leadership. Public service is a great honor. And President Clinton, on behalf of all 12 of us who've had a chance to come up here today, we thank you for giving us a chance to serve. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Honorable Matthew Scott Murphy.
I first met Bill Clinton in 1991. I was 21 years old. It's the first political event I'd ever attended, and I'd been given the honor of being the person meeting the governor's motorcade. I was very excited about this prospect. The reality was a little less glamorous. It consisted of standing in the parking lot in a cold November rainstorm in Boston with the wind blowing and waiting for the cars to arrive. And then I got to wave the cars, show them where to park, and that was the end. I was greeting the motorcade, not the governor. But hearing him speak for the first time that day, his energy, his hope for the future, his optimism, they came through, and he inspired me. Inspired me to cut some classes, not go to school some that spring and that winter, and to go up in New Hampshire and work on his campaign. And up there, I got a great job. I got to go door to door, knocking on doors, looking for people who might vote for him in the primary, and distributing what was a revolutionary new technology, a VHS tape with his bio on it. It looked something like this. It was the first time it had ever been done. Bill Clinton understood innovation. On election night in New Hampshire, I had another job. I was stationed in the phone room where we'd wired up a bunch of lines, and we were getting calls from every courthouse around New Hampshire about the results as they came in. And when they did, it was my job to take a piece of paper and run. Yes, physically run from there to the suite where the governor was staying. Now, why would you run that information over there? Because at that point, we didn't have iPhones. We didn't even have cell phones. All we had were tennis shoes. Now, when I got to the suite, I handed that piece of paper to Mickey Cantor, who I've not seen in 20 years until I saw him before this speech at lunch. But I thought it was incredibly apropos of what we're going on with today, because that night, when Bill Clinton came back in that first primary election, and when those men, Mickey Cantor and Bill Clinton, went on to serve in our government, Mickey Cantor as the trade representative and then as the Secretary of Commerce, we began the motion towards the global economy. They were leading us to that economy where we saw global production and global innovation. And they pushed open the borders with APEC, with the WTO, and with NAFTA. And this drove innovation so much faster than it could have come if we had decided to go it alone. What did we see? We saw Samsung developing cell phones. We saw Nokia in Finland developing cell phones. We saw the BlackBerry come down from Canada. This is now the way that we communicate. And what did we see as a result of that? What happened today? The two most advanced makers of those devices that we would call cell phones, now they've got even newer names, are American companies that no one in the country would have imagined would be making phones when Bill Clinton was elected president. Apple and Google, they're the world leaders in innovation. They're the ones driving that forward, and that's all because of the decisions they made to drive that global innovation. It might have come, but it wouldn't have come today without that leadership that drove us into that global competition, and we won. We're the ones with the leaders as a result of that decision. Now, as much as I love my job as a runner, I decided after I graduated from college, which I did manage to do for any of you in the audience that decide to go off on a campaign, go ahead and finish. I decided I needed a new job. And partially as a result of the hope and optimism Bill Clinton inspired in me, I became an internet entrepreneur. I started my first company in my apartment at night after I went to work, and we grew those businesses, taking advantages of the new possibilities that Bill Clinton unleashed. And as an entrepreneur, I learned something that Bill Clinton already knew, that America's economic success is built on innovation, and that great innovation is not an accident. It comes when the public and private sectors work together. When we leapt forward during World War II with sonar and radar and penicillin and atomic energy, it wasn't an accident. When we went to the moon and tackled thousands of problems we'd never even thought of, solving that wasn't an accident. For the last 50 years, when we've watched medical devices and drugs and innovations in our healthcare system take us forward and extend our health, that wasn't an accident. And over the last 20 years, while we watched what the Defense Department started as ARPANET move into the internet and the World Wide Web and all the innovations that have come behind it, that wasn't an accident. In all those cases, the government was funding the primary research and the development and getting us through the overwhelmingly expensive, risky, and daunting first steps that then allowed the private enterprise to come along and build on top of that foundation. That's what Bill Clinton knew about taking us into the global economy, and that's what he knew about driving the internet forward. We heard so many people talk about this, but it was something that decisions mattered. And he also knew that to have this thriving economy, you had to invest. We've heard about it all day long, but I'm going to talk about two investments that he made that didn't get mentioned yet today. One in the public sector. He went forward and put money out so that we could hire 100,000 new police officers and put them on the beat in our cities. Now, many of the students here don't remember the 70s and the 80s when our cities were failing, people were fleeing, and crime was out of control. But I do. That's when I first moved to the big cities. President Clinton invested in our police and turned that around so that we're living in an urban renaissance where our creative classes are flocking to those cities, driving that innovation which powers our economy in San Francisco, in Boston, in New York City, and right here in Washington. And he also knew that that investment has to come in the private sector. And that's where the jobs and the wealth are created in our economy that allow us to do the things we want to do in government. He passed the Telecom Act of 1996 to open up competition in the telecommunications space that saw the biggest boom in history in investments in the infrastructure we needed. And as a result today, we've got high-speed internet almost all over our country because that investment was made in response to his policies. That's what his leadership did that drove that internet economy forward. Now, he made all these investments, as we heard so much today, while balancing the budget. It's hard to imagine today, in the Congress I was in 2 years ago, it's hard to imagine the environment we live in. It was just 10 years ago. Many of the people in the audience were 10 years old, that we had those surpluses. We had a path to a future that was fiscally responsible. And that was the result of the hard work of all the people you saw on this stage here today. Now, there's one more thing that I want to mention that I think got left out of much of the panel, as it often does. And that's the renewed sense of hope and optimism that President Clinton brought to our entire nation. It inspired me to go start businesses. It inspired a whole generation of new entrepreneurs to go out and take that leap of faith, to quit their jobs, to take the risks, to innovate and create the new industries that drive our economy forward. Now, every president faces a different set of circumstances and challenges. There's no cookie-cutter solutions to driving an economy as complex as ours, but in 1992, Bill Clinton made the choices to embrace innovation, to lead the world forward to a global economy, to bring the public and private sectors together, to invest in America, and to balance our budget, and to do it all with hope and optimism about where we were going. The results speak for themselves. 22.9 million new jobs. Reductions to people living in poverty, 4% unemployment, real wage growth for all Americans across every income bracket, and an ever more connected global world. It is my great honor to introduce the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Please, thank you. Thank you very much, President DeGioia. Thank you for bringing me back to Georgetown. I want to thank Scott Murphy. I wanted all of you to hear him, and I thought the students could identify with him, and he did start out with me 20 years ago. 2 years ago, actually less than that, a year ago, and the Monday, the day before the election, I was with him in his congressional district in upstate New York, and we had 1,200 people for a breakfast at 7:30 in the morning. And I thought that maybe he would escape the tide of 2010. And he didn't. Scott is my 2010 version of what happened to Marjorie in 1994. People got a fever. They only elect Democrats, you know, when things are screwed up. And they want to feel fixed, and they didn't feel fixed yet. So in this sort of anti-government fever, sometimes people are swept from office who shouldn't be. I hope I live long enough to see him go back to Congress because he really understands the economy and the country. And I'm delighted that he's here and honored by his introduction. And he was asked today because my staff heard me say when I came back, that guy introduced me to speak at his rally, and in 3 minutes he showed he understood more about the economic strategy we pursued than 90% of the people that I talked to. So thank you. I want to thank all the members of my administration, thank you, Bob Rubin, for speaking, and thank you, Erskine and John, for moderating the panels, and all of you who participated. I was so proud all over again. You know, basically, I could have had a lobotomy and succeeded as president because of them. They were so good, and you saw that. And I'm very grateful to them for being here, and for all of you who are part of the administration who are here who weren't on the program. I'd like to thank Georgetown for letting me come back here to where we all began this 20 years ago with the 3 speeches I gave outlining, as they said, the philosophy that was driving the campaign. One of those speeches is reprinted in the program you all have. And then I think you have this little page which summarizes most but not all of the things we did to try to drive the economy. And I'd like to especially say I'm grateful that Professor Owais is here, who was my international economics professor in 1967. 1967. And I'm really proud of him for many reasons. He is an Egyptian, and all those young Egyptians in Tahrir Square, they ought to be modeling him. And 40 years after I was his student, I saw him at the Georgetown contribution to the multi-university complex in Qatar. And it was great. So we've been friends a long time. Thank you for being here. And I want to say one other thing. At the end there, Gene Sperling was telling you about the run-up to the government shutdown, which led to all the cooperation later. And he mentioned that we had a big fight over Medicaid because the Republicans basically wanted to end the guarantee of health care to poor people and just cut a check to the states, and I wouldn't do it. And I did say to Dick Armey, who was basically, at that point, he and Newt Gingrich and Tom DeLay were in the Oval Office with the Democrats, with Dick Gephardt, and then Bob Dole and Tom Daschle were just sort of watching the food fight unfold. And so I did say to Dick Armey, when he was getting very macho with me, that he would have to, I told him, I said, you got to understand, Dick, I don't care if I go to 5% in the polls, you will have to get somebody else to sit behind that desk before you get this done. And so all the Democrats were thrilled, you know. Our liberal base always thinks the president's going to cave, just like the conservatives are always afraid the Republicans are going to cave. So anyway, we had this meeting, and then they left. The meeting was adjourned, and the Democrats hung around afterward, and they were all so happy. And Al Gore, in this totally droll tone of voice, looked at me and he said, you know, that was really great what you said, but really, he said, I think you should have told them that you were going to hold out even if you went all the way to 0. Why did you stop at 5%? And I looked at him and I said, no, Al, if we get to 4%, I'm going to cave. So I say that because one lesson of all this is you've got to keep your sense of humor here. And I was aided in that because in 1999, at the very end of my term at least, I was aided because in 1999 we celebrated the 30th anniversary of America's walk on the moon, when we had an astronaut walk on the moon. And the surviving participants came back to the White House and we had a wonderful event. And NASA actually brought me a vacuum-packed moon rock that was carbon dated at 3.6 billion years old. And so you've all, you know, every time you see the president entertaining a foreign leader, you know, they're there in those two chairs, and then there's that little round table. So when you meet with other people in Congress, you're either meeting in the cabinet room, which you've all seen on television, or you're in the Oval Office, but the president's not sitting behind the desk. You go and sit in those chairs, and then everybody sits in the sofas opposite, and there's a table in the middle. I put the moon rock on the table. And then every time the temperature started to rise in the last 2 years I was there, I'd say, wait a minute, guys, look at that rock. That rock is 3.6 billion years old. Believe me, we are just passing through here. So everybody just take a deep breath and let's figure out what we're going to do. And it had that rock. That moon rock did more to lower people's blood pressure than any medicine devised by any pharmaceutical company anywhere on earth. I would like to close by just saying a few things. First of all, I'm deeply grateful for what has been said and the contributions that have been made. But when I came here in December of 1991, and in November, we started in November, the country had at that time manifestations of many of the underlying economic realities that are gripping us today. It was already obvious that we were undergoing a big increase in income inequality. And so it's so easy for me now to make speeches around the country and around the world because I get to say the same things I've been saying for 20 years, updated. It is not healthy for a country that depends upon the idea of opportunity, the idea of social mobility, the idea that having a job or starting a business is way more than just earning incomes and staying busy all day. It is fundamental to human dignity and to the fire of human imagination. And so when we have 9% unemployment, and you know it's really 15 if the labor force participation rates were the same today as they were in 2000. And then you know it's bigger than that because there's so many people who aren't in the numbers because they've got part-time jobs but they have full-time jobs. It's about more than the economics. And I think it's important to say that because if, like me, you were born around the end of World War II, or for the next 15 or 20 years, and you were sort of just halfway intelligent and halfway diligent, and you showed up and went to school, the one thing you never had to worry about was whether you could stay gainfully employed and support yourself. And first job I ever had was cutting lawns when I was 12. I talked my way into a job with the guy that owned a little grocery store across the street from my house when I was 13. I talked him into letting me set up my very first small business, a used comic book stand, where I sold all these mint condition used comic books and made $300. I thought I was a millionaire, and it was the single dumbest decision I ever made in my life. If I had saved those comic books, they'd be worth $250,000 today. But anyway, I did it. By the time I got out of college, I'd done, I don't know, 7, 8 more things for a living. By the time I got out of law school, I'd done 7 more things. And since then, not counting my foundation work, my charitable work, I've done, I don't know, 9 more things for a living. I never had to worry about whether I could make a living. And I think it is very important that we acknowledge today this, what it does to a country if a substantial number of decent people who are perfectly intelligent and perfectly able to be productive and perfectly willing to get up every day and do what they're supposed to do go months and months and months without jobs, are weighed down by paralyzing debt and even more by paralyzing doubt. Because what doubt does is it keeps you from playing the game. Did you guys watch that World Series game last night? By the time it got to the end, I didn't want either one of them to lose. Why? Because they decided they would play the game to the end. Most people would have been broken by doubt if they'd gotten banged around the way St. Louis did, mostly by self-inflicted wounds, which is how most of us get banged around. But they just kept playing the game. So I wanted Americans to feel good about our country again. I wanted people to get up in the morning and feel like they could play the game and have their dreams and pursue their dreams, and that their kids would have a chance to chase their dreams. And we designed this economic plan for the realities of that time. But the values behind it, the idea that we needed a society where there was opportunity for all, which is another way of saying we should be shooting for shared prosperity. That there was responsibility from all, which is another way of saying we all ought to carry some load. That there was opportunity for all, which is another way of saying we can't afford to be divided. We need to create an environment that widens the circle of opportunity, that includes more people in our family, and in my opinion, has a totally different attitude toward immigration than a lot of people do today. I don't think that Americans are being kept out of work because there are illegal immigrants in the country. I think it's a big mistake. I don't think that's hurting them. So, but it is very important to recognize that basically, as you heard from these two panels, our economic strategy began but did not end with trying to get a hold of the debt and turn it around, the deficits, and equalize the chances in life by passing the Earned Income Tax Credit. Most everything that was set up here is consistent with my memory, except I checked one thing with Bob Rubin. The reason the senators were saying, as Laura said, they wanted a $500 billion reduction in the debt is that that's what we were all being told by the bond market people. And I used to give Rubin unshirted hell, saying, you know, why should a 30-year-old bond trader be able to force me to raise the gas tax and put some of my congressmen in danger? Why should they say we won't take this seriously until we see a middle class that has been pummeled for 12 years suffer just a little more so Wall Street can say it counts? And we had all these people, these talking heads on respectable networks. The people Fox says are so liberal, they were sitting there saying, oh, Bill Clinton's not a serious president unless he really sticks it to the middle class. That's how you prove that you are a really reputable person. You know, it ain't like these people hadn't had their income going down for 12 years in real terms. Show us you're a real man and punish those people. You're laughing, but I'm telling you, that's, if you could go back and look at the commentary of the time, it was, to me, revolting. I was out there living with those people. I'd been governor of Arkansas for 12 years. We were one of only 8 states in the last 8 years I served as governor that grew manufacturing jobs. I knew what was happening to people's lives out there. I thought, why are these people in Washington saying you're not a real man unless you stick it to the middle class? Could it be that they're not in the middle class anymore, those who were saying that? But anyway, it was a weird time. And I used to, and Bob, I have to acknowledge the lack of presence here of the man who was handling our congressional lobbying then, Howard Pastor, who passed away after a very brave battle with brain cancer. But we had a memorial service for him the other day, and he was a very funny guy. So Pastor would say, how am I going to get the votes for this? And I would say, well, Rubin says, the bond market says, we've got to bring the deficit down $500 billion. And Pastor looked at me and he said, tell me again how many votes the bond market has in Congress. And we had all these conversations. And then we had the crazy thing, the BTU tax. It's a travesty that the Senate wouldn't vote for it because it really was a carbon tax. It was really a carbon tax. And it was not concentrated on gasoline. It was spread broadly throughout all energy use. It would have been much easier to pay, much less burdensome, even though the gas tax didn't amount to much because the oil prices were so low and the gasoline prices were low. So Marjorie had to walk that plank because you had some of these congressmen that said, well, I said I wouldn't vote for a gas tax. I'm not going to do it. Even if it sinks the administration and keeps the economy in recession, yes, I'm not going to do it. So there was a lot of zany, crazy stuff, but it's important to back up and see the big picture. The big picture is this. We had a growing middle class and a booming economy, although we had some recessions, from the end of World War II till 1981. In 1981, we began the era of anti-government. President Reagan's inaugural address said, in this era, the government is the problem. And that was a code word for most of these years, except for 1995 and 2011. That was code for saying taxes are the problem. Regulations are the problem. That's always the problem, and the answer, therefore, is always less of it. Then there was a sudden discovery of being concerned about spending levels when a Democrat got in the White House. Happened in 95, happened in 2011. But if you look at it, it's basically, beginning in 1981, we did something our country had never done before. We had never consistently run big deficits in peacetime before. Not ever. And in the beginning, it worked because we only had $1 trillion accumulated debt in 1981, and almost all of it was held by Americans. So we could take on some extra debt. And from 1981 through 1992, we took on debt. We went from a $1 trillion national debt to a $4.5 trillion national debt because it turned out that both parties and the White House wanted to keep on spending. They just stopped paying for it. And it was great. That's like going to the candy store and eating all the candy you want, and you never have to go to the dentist. The problem is, and I guess if I were totally cynical, I'd be happy about this because that's what elected me president. Because it amounted to a decade-long stimulus program. Not like, you know, President Obama's much defamed stimulus program, which actually worked better than everybody thought it would. I'll say more about that in a minute. But anyway, it amounted to a decade-long stimulus program, and it worked fine for the first 8 or 9 years because we'd never done that before in normal economic times. But then the competition for money between the private and the public sector got sufficiently vigorous that interest rates went up and the value of the dollar had to be kept high so we could attract foreign investors to buy our debt, and it was a killer for American manufacturing jobs. And the first President Bush had to bear the burden of what he had rightly first called voodoo economics. And I guess I felt bad about it at the time, you know, and we have become very good friends since we've both been out of office, but I liked him at the time. And there was a cruel historical irony that he had to bear the brunt of a theory that he knew was wrong in 1980 and said so because it violated the laws of economics. People ask me all the time, what great new idea did you and Rubin and your whole economic team bring to Washington? And I say, arithmetic. Oh, me and Einstein, man, we really broke new ground. I just figured if 2 and 2 was 4 in Little Rock, it probably still would be by the time we got here. Now, we're laughing now because it's very, very different now. But the underlying goals of building a society of shared prosperity and shared responsibility and a community where everybody plays a role, that's still the same. And it's more important than ever because the world is growing ever more interdependent. So the first part of our effort was we took a gamble that even though the economy was weak, that if we cut spending and raise revenues, that it would lower interest rates enough that there would be an investment boom and a private sector-led growth. And 92% of the jobs created in those 8 years were private sector jobs. It was the highest percentage in 50 years. And because there was more growth than we thought, the budget was 90% balanced by the time we had the balanced budget bill. That's one of the reasons Erskine could get from the Republicans the children's health insurance bill, and we could give to them a reduction in the capital gains rate, and we could both agree on a child's tax credit and more credit for adopting children and special needs children, because the work was done. I saw a hilarious article in one of the press outlets of primarily the conservative outlets, trying to show that nothing we did had anything to do with balancing the budget. And they pointed to a Congressional Budget Office study starting looking at 1997 through 2001, saying why the net effect of all that, just on the numbers, was to add $10 billion to the debt, which is like 3.5 cents, compared to what the numbers we're talking about today. And all they did was prove how important the vote in 1993 was. That was the work that balanced the budget. It did 90% of it. And so all these people who were saying it didn't, the point is, by then we had different growth estimates, and we had a very good balanced budget plan, and it produced 4 surpluses in a row. But the American people, I don't think, and this is probably my fault, although I did my best, and maybe our press interlocutors never understood there really was a difference between invest and grow economics and trickle-down economics. And so in 2001, in the face of all the evidence of what worked better, we went back to trickle-down economics and doubled the debt of the country again before the financial meltdown. And so the question that we face today is, what is today's version of getting back to shared prosperity and shared responsibility? And I would like to say just a couple of things. First of all, I wish I had been able to make our economic plan permanent, but especially after Marjorie's sacrifice, for which I did give my firstborn to her son in marriage, for which I'm very grateful. But it didn't. And it didn't because there is a persistent appeal to this anti-government philosophy. What did Bruce Reed say? The idea that the government would mess up a 2-car funeral it's still alive and well. And part of it is at the core of our history. We were, after all, organized in reaction to an unaccountable, overreaching British Empire. We did, after all, have founding fathers who thought the most important thing they could do is to both limit and divide the government. So they decided to give us a Bill of Rights, executive, legislative, and judicial branch, and state and national government. So they were worried about abuse of power. And every one of us, number one, believes that criticizing the government is a part of our birthright as citizens. And we can all think of a tax we thought was too high, a regulation we thought was dumb, a law we disagree with, and an official we thought went overboard in the exercise of authority. Every one of us can. So we Americans are always of a divided mind about how much government is enough and how much government is too much. And the dividing line between enough and too much has traditionally, at least in the modern era, defined the parameters of the debate between liberals and conservatives or Republicans and Democrats. But this dominant undercurrent since the 1980 election that government is the problem has been an irresistible paradigm for people discussing this and reporting on it. I still read the papers and I see a conservative is defined as someone who takes the anti-government position, whatever that is. No matter how radical it is, no matter how unconventionally conservative it is, and therefore anyone who disagrees with that becomes a liberal. It makes it easy for reporting, but it's a distortion of the traditional political philosophies. And it's what I was trying to bring an end to with those three speeches here and with the way we govern, trying to break out of the government is the solution, the government is the problem. So as you look at the problems that the President faces today, the dilemmas the members of Congress face today, what I would like to first state the obvious. This is the particular solution we pursued is not appropriate to this particular moment because the problem is different. We had high interest rates, slow growth, an overvalued dollar, a dying manufacturing sector. Here, the manufacturing sector is just about killed, but interest rates are zero, and there's no demand. Do I still think the debt is a problem? I do. Do I think we need a dramatic action to respond to it? I do. I believe Erskine Bowles and Senator Alan Simpson basically did quite a good job with the Simpson-Bowles Commission report. But remember what they recommended. Do this with vigor once you get growth back to the point that you know you're not going to throw us into recession. So thank you, Erskine, for what you did on that. It's a great thing. Thank you. So but there are some things that are relevant. I went back and read some of the things I said when I was trying to raise taxes on upper-income Americans. And when we raised the corporate tax, I bragged on business. I bragged on people making money. I said the only people I'm upset about people that are taking advantage of the tax code, shutting jobs down here and getting rid of them, but I bragged on the idea. We should never be against success. One of America's greatest characteristics is that we don't resent people who do well. And I was raised in that culture, man. When I was a kid, if I ever looked like I resented somebody who did something better than me, my mother was likely to spank me. I mean, as a kid, we were taught that it was a character defect if you resented somebody else for their own success. You should applaud their success and pull for them and expect people. Abraham Lincoln said that did America good to have wealthy people because it fostered industry and creativity and effort in the rest of us. But on the other hand, we know as an economic matter, if we all need to pitch in and do what we can, and we should, then those of us who have gotten all the gains of this decade, just as I did ask people who had gotten all the gains of the decade in the 80s, should make our contribution. That's the contribution we can make. And one of the things that Bruce Reed said, I would like to ask you to keep in mind when every debate the President and the Congress are now having. One of the reasons that I asked Marjorie to cast the vote and save the economic plan, one of the reasons that I put a lot of our members on the hot seat and they lost their seats by voting for the assault weapons bill and the ban and the Brady bill, is that in every well-developed political system, the present and the past are always better represented than the future. The future doesn't have as many votes. The future doesn't have as much money. The future doesn't have as many lobbyists. And no one can be elected to represent the future who has more freedom of movement than the president. The president is subject to the lobbyists, subject to the pressures, subject to the negative ads, But at least you got a big megaphone. You can talk to the American people. You can travel around. No one else can speak for the future if the president refuses to. But I don't want to kid you. I caused a lot of people in my party to get beat for voting for the economic plan or voting for the assault weapons ban or the Brady bill, principally. And I lost a lot of sleepless nights. And I still think about it. And I wanted Scott Murphy to be here because I want him to be one of the ones who makes a comeback, because he's simply too gifted to be a casualty of a momentary snit of anti-government fever that gripped us in 2010. Look, we got big things to do. And I appreciate the fact that the president is still trying to reach out, but also now striking his own course. I like the jobs plan. I think it would help. I like the student loan plan, which is a national system of what we made optional, the direct loan program. Do you see all these kids dropping out of school and student loan defaults at a record rate and all that? That's because college costs went up 75% after inflation. And everything that I did in my second term, which is the biggest increase in student aid since the GI Bill, and then the 2007 Congress passed another huge increase, and it was all blown away by the cost and the condition of the economy. So the president supported and the Congress passed, and he signed a national direct loan plan, which was supposed to be put in 2014, and now they're going to try to move it up and put as much of it as possible in 2012, which basically says to every college student in the country, you never have to drop out of college again because of how much money you have to borrow, because you can pay it back for up to 20 years at no more than 10%, not of your total income, of your discretionary income, which means that it won't include your basic living costs. So you're looking at 5 or 6%. And this is a huge deal, because unemployment among college graduates today is half the national average, 4.5%, and for people with postgraduate degrees, it's 2%. So this is important. I support the president on that. I support what he's trying to do with the jobs plan. I think that we should try to figure out a way to repatriate some of this corporate cash and use it to fund the infrastructure bank. It has some bipartisan support in the Senate, and maybe we can get it through, and we ought to be taking private capital and sovereign wealth investment and anything else into an infrastructure bank and put the American people back to work. I personally think we ought to retrofit every school, every college, every hospital, every auditorium, every museum, every relatively unencumbered commercial building in the entire United States over the next few years. I'm very proud of my governor, Andrew Cuomo, who just signed a bill allowing the cost of retrofitting to be put on the electric bill of every New York homeowner in a way that allows you never to pay more for your utility bill to pay for the retrofit than you were paying before. In other words, you just pay it through the savings. And I think we ought to do that. And the last thing I'll say is I'm encouraged by the fact that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have apparently agreed to let some people refinance their mortgages down to the 4% level, a million or so. But there are 20 million Americans who have not defaulted, who have relatively small amounts of mortgage money out, $150,000, at an average interest rate of 5.6%. The mortgages are owned by the government. If they let them all refinance at 4%, it would put $35 or $40 billion a year back into the American economy in stimulus with no deficit spending and no tax increase, and it would help to stabilize this. I think, for whatever it's worth, to get back to a full employment economy we're going to have to clean the mortgage debt. I just don't think until we deleverage quicker, I don't think it can be done. And that means somebody's going to have to come up with some more money. The federal government's still got about $50 billion in TARP money. I know it's politically controversial because some people believe we shouldn't be helping people who never should have taken those mortgages out in the first place. The problem is everybody's been hurt by this now. Everybody. There are people who didn't do anything wrong when they took out their mortgages, and their house is now worth less than their mortgage. There are people who've never missed a mortgage payment. But in general, I strongly support what has been done. Remember, we got our job growth, as they all said, and as Scott amplified, by accelerating information technology and trying to spread it into every other aspect of American life as quickly and deeply as possible. Here, the president outlined a strategy of doing that with green tech, which, no matter what you read among the skeptics, green tech jobs have grown at twice the rate of overall employment in the last 10 years and account for $54 billion in positive trade balance for us. In bringing back manufacturing jobs, which we can now do, as long as they're high-end jobs, in doubling exports, and in infrastructure. So I support this plan. And it is not inconsistent with bringing down the deficit. The only other thing I want to say about it is this. And only NERA got to address this. The real problem that the Congress will have in dealing with the projected rise in health care costs is the difference between what's good policy and what is scorable. And we used to fight this all the time in other contexts. The best health care policies would help the private health care system just as much as they would help the budget of Medicare and Medicaid. I'll just give you one example. The Geisinger healthcare system in eastern Pennsylvania has more than 700 doctors. If you enroll in the Geisinger program, they promise you, among other things, that if any medical procedure is performed on you and if there's any problem with it that requires you to go back to the hospital within 90 days, you can go back and they will pay for it all. And your premiums won't go up, your copays won't go up, your deductibles won't go up. How can they afford to make such a promise since returns are such an endemic part of American healthcare? Because they operate on a best practices manual which is continuously updated, which all 700 doctors have sworn to uphold, and they implement it. And guess what? Their error rates dropped to almost zero. Their amount of hospital readmissions has gone down, and the inflation in their health care costs is gone way down. And that's just one example. Pennsylvania was the first state in America to require all the major hospital providers to report both the results of their procedures and the costs. And for 3 years running, they've found that there's absolutely no correlation between what people pay for health care and what quality they get. That the biggest correlation is in hospital X, Y, or Z is, besides whether they have uniform sterilization procedures, is how many of these procedures are done. And the more you do, the better they get at it, the better results you get. So I would just say that I would like to see both parties in Congress at least give and Erskine's report writes about this, how we should accelerate the authority of the Secretary of Health and Human Services to implement these money-saving changes. And I would like to see them not hog-tie themselves and do something dumb on health care, which might be unfair to fixed-income people, before we see whether or not we can bring our health care costs closer to our competitors, because we have the levers to do it now. I've already said more about this than I meant to, but I don't think it's healthy just to live in the past. These things I have said are consistent with taking the philosophy we had then, shared prosperity, shared responsibility, a community we're all part of, and going forward. I was thrilled to see the Congress pass the trade bills with Korea and Colombia and Panama. And I know a lot of people in my party think it was a mistake, but I just think it's wrong. Look at where our trade deficit is. Our trade deficit is 50% in energy imports and 50% with countries that we don't have truly comprehensive, all-encompassing trade agreements with. When you negotiate these things and you enforce them, and the thing I really loved about, Mickey didn't say this, but he and Charlene Barshevsky negotiated more than 300 trade agreements, but they also enforced them. And then we got back into the business of being in debt. And so we were borrowing money from the countries that had the biggest trade surpluses with us, and it became more difficult to enforce our trade agreements because nobody gets to slug their banker. You know, you wouldn't do that either. So I wanted to talk about these things because I think I believe in essence that what the president has tried to do is to apply these principles of sharing the future, to put us back in the future business and to make it a shared future on both the prosperity and the responsibility side of the ledger to the current situation. And I believe that there is evidence that some members really would like to see this happen. We can still have an election next year. We can still argue about who ought to be elected. We can still argue about who has the best ideas. But we're in a tight here. And we can't just stop playing the game. We need to up our game. And again, it tickled me to see all those commentators on baseball saying that that was maybe the greatest World Series game ever played last night. It certainly wasn't the prettiest. You know, St. Louis made too many errors, and Texas pitched too many walks. The reason they thought it was a great game is that they played all the way to the end. So if you ask me, did we make some mistakes we probably should have talked about if we were being Simon Pure today? Yeah, we did. We made some mistakes. Or could we have done this, that, or the other thing better? Probably. But the end brought us out all right. If you keep score about whether the future was advanced. I got tickled. Henry was still speaking in his delicate way that he once got an article for me, which I treasure, in 93 or 94 called Clinton's Stealth Anti-Poverty Policy. It said he was the enforcer of our stealth anti-poverty policy. But you look at the results of the Hope 6 housing program and the other things we did to lift people from poverty to the middle class. It's still the number I'm proudest of all. 100 times as many people moved from poverty to the middle class in our 8 years as in the Reagan years. And poverty increased in all the other years on both sides of us. All that matters when you finish this, all that matters is whether people are better off when you quit than when you started, whether kids have a brighter future, and whether things are coming together or being torn apart. The rest of this will all seem like a passing irritant. And I know, I'm old enough now to know that the intelligent people in the Congress in both parties have to know that. So I would just ask them all to go back and remember, number one, you got to share the future, the burdens and the benefits. Until we get back to that, we are not going anywhere. We cannot sustain this level of inequality. And number two, there is not a single solitary example on the planet of a truly successful economy that is pursuing this militant anti-government theory. You can be a little to the right and a little to the left, but all the successful countries have both a vibrant private sector and an effective government. I was thinking about that today because I knew we'd bring up the BTU tax. In 1991, 2 years before that BTU passed, a conservative government in Sweden passed the most unique of all carbon taxes. It was 100% refundable. the government said, we're conservative. We trust people if they actually knew what carbon was doing to our economy and what the burden was on the climate. We trust them to make a good decision. And I'm sure my counterparts in Sweden said, are you out of your mind? You're going to take $5,000 from Bob Rubin, then turn around and cut him a check for $5,000? Give all the money back? I said, yeah, we trust them. And guess what? The trust was well placed. So they grew their economy 50% with no increase in greenhouse gas emissions, with 100% refundable carbon tax, by simply showing what the burden on the environment and the economy and the healthcare of the country was. By putting a price on it, showing people, and then giving them their money back, lo and behold, they made intelligent decisions. That's the sort of conservative liberal debates we ought to be having in America, not this anti-government thing. I was proud of many things, but when I left office, I was very proud that confidence in the federal government had gone up again, that people saw it as a positive force in our life, not the answer, but a partner. I was proud that we'd moved 100 times as many people from poverty to the middle class. But more than that, I thought people could have their dreams again and think about tomorrow again. So I ask you again to ask yourself, is it better to have a partnership or an anti-government strategy? Is it better to believe in invest and grow or trickle down? Is it better to believe in shared prosperity or you're on your own? I don't think it's a close call. We're so nervous about whether we got too much government that once in a while we just lift the gasket and then we have to deal with the aftermath for a while. Everybody needs to calm down and do what we know is best for the future. Thank you very much.